talking about the gender gap, the report that has been compiled by the World Economic Forum. And the key question is what impact COVID-19 has had on this very crucial agenda.
So this was the 15th edition of the report. And every year, what we try to do is understand over the length of time that we've been calculating this index, what is the rate of change, and then try to project that out into the future. And when we did the last edition of the report nearly a year and a half ago, at the end of 2019, the rate of change put us in such a place that gender parity would be achieved in roughly 100 years. Now, that was already not good enough. And what's happened over this last year with the impact of the pandemic and some other factors, it's now looking like it may take us 135.6 years to get to close the gender gap at the current rate of change. Now, these are not precise forecasts. This is simply taking the rate of the past and moving it into the future, but it does tell us that the pandemic disrupted things to the extent that we've added essentially an additional generation or two that would have to wait for gender parity.
Here in South Africa, we're also keenly wanting to understand South Africa's position when it comes to the gender gap. Can you give me some insight on that front?
So South Africa's ranking and score actually don't change by that much. The country is ranked at 18th out of 156 countries that we cover, having closed nearly 78% or just over 78% of its gender gap. And while the ranking is interestingly exactly the same as our first ever gender gap report in 2006, when South Africa was also in 18th position, there actually has been a lot of progress over time, because back then, 71% of the gender gap has been closed. Now, this is not parity. We're nowhere close to that. There's a lot of work still to be done, but overall, there has been improvement. And the reasons behind that are that there has been, over time, marginal progression on the economic participation gender gap. So from 56% of that gap being closed back in 2006 to now nearly 66% of that gap being closed in 2021. And the other element that does put South Africa ahead of others, and therefore brings it into the top 20, is that the country does quite well, relatively speaking, on political empowerment. And for most of the world, that is the area of concern. I'll just add one thing, connecting this to the situation related to the pandemic. In many economies, the biggest reason for the impact of the pandemic is that the sectors that have been the most disrupted tend to be the ones that are very large employers of women. So, for example, travel and tourism, for example, consumer and retail. And in South Africa as well, these are sectors that are being disrupted by two factors. One is, of course, the pandemic itself, but second is the longer term automation trends and digitization trends. And that is where there has to be a very concerted, consistent effort to ensure that women and men alike are getting opportunities to reskill, upskill, redeploy, move into higher value-added work. But particularly so, there has to be a focus on women. And the base is there. Women make up the majority of the professional and technical workers in South Africa, but at the same time, there continue to be gaps, for example, in education.
Sadia, I appreciate the update. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Nielsen Network. Sadia Zahidi is Managing Director, World Economic Forum.